The sun had abandoned Montana early that December afternoon in 1885, retreating behind a wall of gray that promised the season's harshest storm. Wind whipped across the rolling hills outside Willow Creek, carrying the first flakes of what the old-timers predicted would be a three-day howler. The temperature plummeted as daylight faded, transforming breath to fog and hope to desperation. Along the narrow trail that wound through pine and aspen, a woman struggled forward. Each step was agony, her weight shifting awkwardly on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a broken broom handle and strips of fabric. Lillian Reed, 28 years old, though pain had written extra years across her face, paused to gather strength. The bruises that marred her cheekbone had turned a sickly yellow-purple, and her split lip had only just begun to heal. "Mama, it's getting colder," said Sarah, her 6-year-old daughter, whose honey-brown hair spilled from beneath a woolen cap too thin for Montana winter. She clutched her mother's skirt with small, reddened fingers. "Just a little further, love," Lillian whispered, though she had no certainty of shelter ahead. Only rumors of a cabin somewhere along this trail, mentioned in hushed tones by a sympathetic stable hand back in town. 4-year-old Thomas trudged silently beside them, his dark eyes wide and watchful. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since that night, 3 weeks ago, the night Lillian had fled with her children, believing she'd left a dead man behind. The first real squall hit them without warning. Wind roared down from the mountains, bringing a blinding sheet of white. Lillian pulled her children close, knowing with terrible clarity that they would not survive the night exposed to Montana's merciless winter. "There," Sarah's voice cut through the howl. "Mama, look." Through the swirling snow, a warm glow flickered in the distance. A window, a lantern, the promise of walls against the wind. Lillian steeled herself and pressed forward each step, threatening to collapse her broken body. Another 100 yards seemed an impossible distance, but the alternative was unthinkable. By the time they reached the small clearing, Lillian's crutch had splintered further, barely supporting her weight. The cabin stood sturdy against the growing storm smoke curling from its chimney lamplight gleaming from a frost-rimmed window. A barn stood nearby, the soft lowing of cattle within suggesting care and life. Lillian collapsed at the base of 3 wooden steps that led to the porch. Her body simply refused another step. Sarah immediately ran to the door, her small fist pounding against the weathered wood with surprising force. "Hello? Please? Is anyone there?" she called, her young voice nearly lost in the wind. No response came. Sarah looked back at her mother's crumpled form, and something hardened in her childish features. She knocked again, louder, more insistent. The door swung open suddenly, startling the girl backward. Framed in the doorway stood a man tall enough that Sarah had to crane her neck to see his face. He held a shotgun in one hand, pointed toward the ground but ready. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, contrasting with hair that touched his shoulders. In the lamplight, his eyes appeared almost amber, narrowed with suspicion. "What business have you here?" His voice was deep disuse, making it rough around the edges. Sarah swallowed, but stood her ground. "Sir, if we clean your cabin, would you let Mama sleep here? She's too bruised to walk." The man's gaze shifted beyond Sarah to where Lillian lay half-conscious in the snow, Thomas kneeling beside her. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Where's your father?" he asked, voice softer but still wary. "Gone," Sarah answered simply. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, the man stood motionless. The wind grew fiercer, snow collecting on Sarah's eyelashes and Lillian's splayed skirts. Finally, he lowered the shotgun completely and stepped onto the porch. "Get her inside," he said gruffly. "Storm's worsening." With surprising gentleness for his size, the man lifted Lillian from the snow. She flinched instinctively at his touch, eyes flying open in alarm, before the pain overwhelmed her senses again. Thomas shrank back, but Sarah caught his hand, pulling him forward as they followed the stranger into the cabin's warmth. Inside the cabin was larger than it appeared, from without a main room with a stone fireplace kitchen area and a heavy wooden table. 2 doors led to what Sarah presumed were bedrooms. Unlike most bachelor quarters, the space was orderly, almost Spartan in its neatness. Books lined shelves along one wall, well-worn and carefully arranged. The man laid Lillian on a narrow bed against the far wall. "She needs warming," he muttered, more to himself than to the children. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared in the hearth, then filled a kettle and hung it over the flames. "My name is Sarah Reed," the girl announced, standing straight, as though giving a recitation at school. "This is my brother Thomas, and our mother is Lillian Reed. We are pleased to meet you, sir." The man glanced at her, something like surprise crossing his features. "Ethan Porter," he replied after a moment. "This is my property you've wandered on to." Sarah nodded solemnly. "We'll clean very well to pay for staying, Mr. Porter. I can sweep and dust, and Thomas is good at stacking wood. Aren't you, Thomas?" The boy nodded silently, still half hidden behind his sister. Ethan turned his attention to Lillian, who was beginning to stir. He frowned at the visible bruises on her face and neck, at the awkward angle of her ankle beneath her skirt. When she opened her eyes fully, he stepped back, giving her space. "Where?" Lillian began struggling to sit up before gasping with pain. "Don't move," Ethan said. "Your ankle's likely broken, and you've nearly frozen besides." "Mama, we found a cabin." Sarah hurried to her mother's side. "This is Mr. Porter. I told him we'd clean if he'd let us stay." Lillian's gaze darted anxiously to Ethan, then back to her children. The instinctive fear in her eyes was something Ethan recognized all too well. It was the look of prey, sensing a predator nearby. "You and your children can shelter here until the storm passes," he said, keeping his distance, nothing required in return. The kettle whistled, and he turned away to make tea, giving Lillian a moment to compose herself. When he returned with a steaming mug, he placed it on the small table beside the bed rather than handing it directly to her. "It's willow bark," he explained. "Helps with pain." Lillian hesitated before reaching for the mug. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. We won't impose long, just until the storm passes." Ethan finished for her. "That'll be 3 days at least, if the sky's any indication." He moved to a trunk in the corner and retrieved a thick woolen blanket, which he handed to Sarah. "For your mother, there's stew warming. You children should eat." As Sarah tucked the blanket around Lillian, the woman finally took a proper look at their reluctant host. Ethan Porter was perhaps in his mid-30s, with the weathered complexion of a man who lived outdoors. His clothing was simple but well-maintained, a cotton shirt rolled at the sleeves, wool trousers, sturdy boots. But it was his eyes that held her attention, amber-brown and watchful, carrying a wariness that matched her own. "Mr. Porter," she began again, her voice steadier. "I appreciate your kindness, but I must ask, are we far from town?" "From Willow Creek. 5 miles southeast," he answered. "Though it might as well be 50, with what's coming down out there." Lillian nodded, some tension easing from her shoulders, even as her brow remained furrowed with worry. The pain in her ankle throbbed in time with her heartbeat, but the warmth of the cabin was already bringing feeling back to her frozen fingers. Ethan ladled stew into bowls for the children, setting them at the table. Thomas approached cautiously, but hunger overcame his shyness. Sarah joined him, though she kept glancing back at their mother. "Eat, Sarah," Lillian encouraged weakly. "Both of you." While the children ate, Ethan moved about the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering medical supplies. When he approached Lillian again, he stayed within her line of sight, his movements deliberate and slow. "Your ankle needs tending," he said, "and that crutch of yours is more splinter than support. May I?" Lillian swallowed hard, then nodded. Self-preservation warred with necessity, and necessity won. Ethan worked with surprising gentleness, removing her worn boot and examining the swollen ankle beneath. His touch was clinical, impersonal, yet careful not to cause additional pain. "Sprained badly, not broken," he pronounced after a thorough examination. "You've been walking on this for some time." It wasn't a question, but Lillian answered anyway. 3 weeks. It's improved, actually." Ethan's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the determination such a journey would require. He wrapped the ankle firmly with a clean bandage, then sat back on his heels. "The bruises," he said quietly, nodding toward her face, and the marks visible at her collarbone. "Those weren't from a fall." Lillian's gaze dropped to her hands. "No." Ethan nodded once, asking nothing more. He rose and returned to the kitchen area, allowing her privacy with her thoughts. After a moment, he spoke again, his back still turned. "Second door leads to a small room. Your children can sleep there tonight. You take this bed. It's closest to the fire." "And you, Mr. Porter?" Lillian asked. "I'll manage," he replied simply. Outside, the storm unleashed its full fury, wind howling through the eaves and snow piling against the window panes. Inside, an uneasy truce settled between strangers thrown together by circumstance and winter's wrath. Morning brought no reprieve from the storm. If anything, it had intensified overnight, the world beyond the cabin's walls transformed into a howling white void. Ethan had risen before dawn, rekindling the fire and checking his livestock before returning with fresh milk and eggs. He found Sarah already awake, attempting to sweep the floor with a broom nearly twice her height. "I'm cleaning," she explained seriously, "like I promised." Ethan took the broom gently from her hands. "There's no need. Sit by the fire and warm yourself." Sarah's small brow furrowed. "But we have to pay for staying." "That's how it works." Something in her determined expression stirred a memory in Ethan, another child long ago with that same premature sense of obligation. He set the broom aside and knelt to her level. "Your mother needs rest, and you need warmth," he said. "That's all that matters now." From the bed, Lillian watched the exchange through half-lidded eyes. She had slept fitfully, pain and unfamiliar surroundings conspiring against rest. Now she observed as this stranger, this man who owed them nothing, spoke to her daughter with unexpected gentleness. "Sarah," she called softly. "Come here, love." The girl hurried to her mother's side. Thomas emerged from the small bedroom, hair tousled from sleep, eyes wary, as always. "Good morning, Mr. Porter," Lillian said, struggling to sit up straighter. "I hope we haven't disrupted your routine too severely." Ethan shook his head, turning his attention to breakfast preparation. "Routine's a luxury in winter." As he worked, Lillian took stock of their situation. The willow bark tea had dulled the worst of her pain, but her body remained a catalogue of hurts: the sprained ankle, bruised ribs, the deeper ache of exhaustion that seemed to have seeped into her very bones. Still, they were alive, sheltered from the killing cold. For now, that would have to be enough. Breakfast was a simple affair: cornbread, eggs, and milk. But to children who had subsisted on whatever Lillian could beg or scavenge for weeks, it seemed a feast. Even Thomas ate eagerly, some color returning to his pale cheeks. "Your children have good manners," Ethan observed as he cleared the plates. "They were raised properly before." Lillian stopped herself, unwilling to open that door. "Thank you for the meal, Mr. Porter." Ethan nodded, then retrieved Lillian's makeshift crutch from where it leaned against the wall. He examined it critically, turning it in his large hands. "This won't hold you another mile," he said. "I'll fashion something sturdier." Before she could protest, he had taken the crutch and his tools to the workbench in the corner. Lillian watched as he worked his hands, deftly shaping wood with practiced ease. There was something soothing in the rhythmic sound of his movements, the scratch of sandpaper and tap of hammer. Sarah approached him cautiously, drawn by curiosity. "Were you always a woodworker, Mr. Porter?" Ethan glanced at the girl. "No." "What were you before?" A shadow passed over his features. "Someone else entirely." Sarah accepted this cryptic answer with a child's adaptability. "Can I help?" After a moment's hesitation, Ethan showed her how to hold the sandpaper, guiding her small hand over the rough edges of wood until they were smooth. Thomas drifted over to watch, maintaining his distance but clearly interested. Lillian observed from her sickbed a strange tightness in her throat. How long had it been since her children had interacted with a man who didn't fill them with terror? How long since they'd known anything but fear and flight? Later, when the children were occupied with the wooden blocks Ethan had produced from a trunk, he brought the finished crutch to Lillian. "Oak," he explained, demonstrating its sturdiness, padded at the top and wrapped with leather for grip. Lillian ran her fingers over the craftsmanship, touched by the care evident in every detail. "This must have taken hours." Ethan shrugged. "Storm's not letting up. Time is plentiful." She tested the crutch, finding it perfectly sized to her height, the padded rest comfortable under her arm. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "There's no debt," he said firmly. "None." Something in his tone suggested a deeper meaning, but before Lillian could respond, Sarah called out excitedly, "Mama, look! There are books!" Indeed, the shelf Lillian had noticed the previous night held dozens of volumes. Sarah stood before it, wonder in her eyes. "May I look at them, Mr. Porter?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "You read, Mama taught us," Sarah said proudly. "She was a teacher before." Ethan's gaze shifted to Lillian, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "From Boston, by your accent." Lillian blinked. "Yes. How did you—" "I recognize the inflection." He offered no further explanation, turning instead to help Sarah reach a volume on a higher shelf. As the day progressed, the storm showed no sign of abating. Snow piled higher against the windows, and the wind found every crack and crevice in the cabin's construction, creating eerie whistles and moans. Ethan ventured out twice to check on his livestock, returning each time with fresh powder clinging to his coat and boots. Lillian dozed intermittently, the combination of willow bark tea and bone-deep exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, despite her vigilance. Each time she woke, she found her children safe reading with surprising concentration in Thomas's case, or helping Ethan with small tasks around the cabin. By late afternoon, she felt strong enough to attempt standing. Using the new crutch, she managed to hobble to the table where she sank gratefully onto a chair. "You should rest longer," Ethan said, frowning at her effort. "I've imposed on your hospitality enough," Lillian replied. "Besides, I can't lie abed forever." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "There's coffee, if you'd like." As they sat at the table, an awkward silence settled between them. Lillian cradled the warm mug between her palms, gathering courage. "Mr. Porter," she began hesitantly, "I feel I owe you some explanation." "You owe me nothing." He interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "Least of all your story." Relief washed over her. "Even so, my children and I were grateful." More than I can express. Ethan inclined his head in acknowledgement. The storm should break by tomorrow evening. After that, the trails will need a day to clear enough for travel. The implication was clear. They had time, but not unlimited time. Lillian nodded, pushing away the flutter of anxiety at the thought of leaving this unexpected sanctuary. Of course, we'll be on our way as soon as possible. As evening approached, Ethan prepared another simple but hearty meal. The domesticity of the Scene children at the table food shared in the warmth, while winter raged outside created an illusion of normalcy that made Lillian's chest ache with a forgotten longing. After supper, Sarah discovered a chess set tucked away on a shelf. "Do you play, Mr. Porter?" "I did," he answered. "Once." "Will you teach me?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Lillian watched as he patiently explained the movement of each piece to her daughter, who absorbed the information with solemn concentration. Even Thomas crept closer to observe. As the evening deepened, Lillian found herself studying their host more carefully. There was a deliberateness to Ethan Porter, a controlled precision in his movements that spoke of discipline beyond that of an ordinary rancher. His cabin, though isolated, contained unexpected refinements: the books, the chess set, a writing desk with quality paper and ink. And there was the locked room, the second bedroom he never entered, that Sarah had mentioned seeing when she explored that morning. A man with secrets, then. But weren't they all harboring secrets in this cabin tonight? Later, after the children had been tucked into bed in the small room, Lillian hobbled to the porch, despite Ethan's protests about the cold. She needed air, needed a moment away from watchful eyes, even kind ones. The storm had eased somewhat, the wind no longer howling but sighing through the pines. Snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flakes, illuminated by the light, spilling from the cabin windows. The world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful, dangers hidden beneath a blanket of pristine white. The door opened behind her, and Ethan stepped out, offering a heavy blanket without comment. Lillian accepted it gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I'll leave at dawn, if the weather permits," she said quietly. "I cannot bring more shame upon another man's home." Ethan stood beside her, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Shame," he repeated the word, hanging between them. "Is that what you think you carry?" Lillian turned to look at him, startled by the question. "The town already whispers about you, Mr. Porter. I heard it when we passed through. The recluse, the man who turned his back on society. I won't add to those burdens." "Those whispers mean nothing to me," he said, "and you carry no shame that belongs to you." The certainty in his voice, the first real emotion he had revealed, caught her off guard. "You cannot know that. I know the difference between victim and perpetrator," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the distant darkness. "I've spent a lifetime learning it." Silence fell between them, filled only by the soft shush of falling snow. Finally, Lillian spoke again. "I thought I killed him," she whispered, the confession escaping before she could stop it. "My husband. I struck him with a fire iron when he came for Sarah. There was so much blood. I was certain he was dead." She waited for judgment, for disgust, for fear. Instead, Ethan remained steady beside her. "Did he deserve the blow?" he asked simply. "Yes." No hesitation in her answer. Ethan nodded once. "Then you defended your own. There's no shame in that." A sob caught in Lillian's throat, quickly stifled. 3 weeks of running, of looking over her shoulder, of wondering if she was both victim and murderer, and this stranger had absolved her with 6 simple words. "Come inside," he said gently. "The cold will undo all your healing." They returned to the warmth of the cabin, where Lillian settled once more on the bed by the fire. Ethan busied himself banking the flames for the night. "You were more than a rancher once," she observed quietly. "The way you speak the books you keep." Ethan paused in his work. "We all have previous lives, Mrs. Reed." "Lillian," she corrected. "Please." He straightened, regarding her thoughtfully. "Rest, Lillian. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns." As he turned to his own sleeping place, a bedroll near the door, she noted with a pang of guilt, Lillian called softly after him. "Thank you, Ethan. Not just for the shelter, but for—" she faltered, unable to articulate the deeper gift he had given her, a moment free from fear, from judgment, from the crushing weight of her choices. "You're welcome," he answered simply, understanding in his eyes. Sleep came easier that night, the willow bark tea and emotional exhaustion conspiring to pull Lillian into the deepest rest she had known since fleeing Boston all those months ago. Dawn of the third day brought unexpected sunshine. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Pristine drifts that sparkled blindingly in the morning light, branches bowed under the weight of snow icicles hanging like crystal daggers from the eaves. Lillian woke to find the cabin empty, save for Thomas, who sat quietly by the window watching the sunlight play across the snow. She realized with a start that she had slept through the night and well into morning. "Thomas, where are Sarah and Mr. Porter?" she asked, reaching for her crutch. "Outside." The boy answered softly, the word so unexpected that Lillian froze momentarily. It was the first time he had spoken unprompted since that terrible night. She made her way to the window, standing behind her son. Outside, Ethan was showing Sarah how to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow. The girl followed in his footsteps, carefully placing her small boots in his larger prints to avoid sinking into the deeper drifts. "Sarah wanted to help with the animals," Thomas explained, his voice still hushed but steady. "Mr. Porter said I could stay with you." Lillian rested her hand on his small shoulder. "Do you feel safe here, Thomas?" The boy considered this with the seriousness that had become his hallmark. "He's not like Papa," he finally said. "He doesn't shout, and his hands are gentle when he helps us." Such simple observations, yet they revealed volumes about what her children had endured, what they noticed, what mattered to them. Lillian swallowed against the familiar ache of failure that rose whenever she thought of how long she had kept them in that house with that man. "No, he's not like your father," she agreed softly. By the time Ethan and Sarah returned, their cheeks pink with cold and exertion, Lillian had managed to stoke the fire and heat water for coffee. She balanced awkwardly at the stove, determined to contribute something to the household that had sheltered them. "The trails are clearing," Ethan reported, as he helped Sarah remove her snow-covered outer garments. "But town is still a difficult journey. The stage won't run for another day, at least." Lillian nodded, understanding the unspoken message they could remain another night without imposing. "Thank you. We'll be ready to leave tomorrow then." Ethan hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "This is yours, I believe." He handed her a small object, a silver locket on a broken chain. Lillian stared at it in disbelief. How did you find this?" The locket contained miniature portraits of her children painted in happier times. Victor had torn it from her neck during their final confrontation. "It was caught in the lining of your cloak," Ethan explained. "I noticed it while hanging your things to dry yesterday. The chain needs repair, but the locket itself is undamaged." Lillian clutched it tightly, tears threatening. This small treasure, this piece of her former life, she had thought it lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to express what the recovery meant to her. The day passed in a strange, peaceful rhythm. Ethan tended his livestock and repaired minor damage the storm had caused to the barn. Lillian rested her ankle but insisted on helping with indoor tasks, teaching Sarah to make biscuits and allowing Thomas to assist in simple chores that seemed to bring him comfort. In the afternoon, Ethan disappeared into the locked room, briefly emerging with a book that he handed to Sarah. "You might enjoy this one," he said. "Adventure stories, nothing too frightening." The girl accepted the volume reverently, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." While the children read by the fire, Lillian found herself alone with Ethan at the table, a pot of coffee between them. The domesticity of it all was disarming, dangerous in its comfort. "You're very good with them," she observed. "The children, I mean." Ethan's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes softened. "They're good children, resilient." "Yes," she agreed. "More than they should have to be." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional turning of pages and the pop of burning wood in the fireplace. Lillian found herself studying Ethan's profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath the neatly trimmed beard, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had once smiled more frequently. "You've been very kind, Mr. Porter," she began, needing suddenly to fill the silence. "I want you to know that we won't bring trouble to your door. Once we reach town tomorrow, we'll take the first stage heading east." Ethan's gaze met hers directly. "Is east where you want to go?" The question was unexpected, piercing through her rehearsed plans. It's away, that's all that matters now. And if he's still alive, your husband, if he's looking for you." Lillian's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "Then we keep running." Ethan considered this, then spoke carefully. "Running is exhausting, Lillian. Believe me, I know." Before she could respond, a sound outside drew their attention, the jingle of harness bells and creak of wagon wheels. Ethan rose immediately, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Stay inside," he instructed, reaching for his coat and gun. Sarah looked up from her book, eyes wide. "Is it Papa? Has he found us?" "No, sweetheart," Lillian assured her, though her own heart raced with the same fear. "Stay with Thomas by the fire." Ethan stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, Lillian watched as he approached a horse-drawn sleigh that had pulled up in front of the cabin. The driver was an elderly man bundled against the cold, his beard white with age and frost. After a brief conversation that Lillian couldn't hear, Ethan turned and beckoned for her to join them. Reluctantly, she took her crutch and made her way outside. "Mrs. Reed," Ethan said formally, "this is Doc Sullivan from town. He makes rounds after storms to check on outlying homesteads." The old man nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, heard we had visitors in the area. Thought I'd stop by with supplies and see if medical attention was needed." Lillian relaxed slightly, though wariness remained. "That's very kind, Doctor. I've sprained my ankle, but Mr. Porter has tended it capably." "Ethan's good with injuries," Doc Sullivan agreed, his keen eyes taking in the fading bruises on her face without comment. "Military training serves well in these parts." Military. The word clicked into place some of the pieces of Ethan Porter's puzzle. The discipline, the precision, the careful way he moved. A soldier, then, before becoming a reclusive rancher. "Come inside, Doc," Ethan invited. "Coffee's hot." The physician joined them in the cabin, greeting the children with gentle warmth that soon had even Thomas responding to his questions. He examined Lillian's ankle with professional detachment, nodding approval at Ethan's handiwork. "Healing nicely," he pronounced. "Keep it wrapped and elevated when possible. Another week, and you'll be walking without that crutch, though I'd avoid dancing for a while longer." His attempt at humor drew a small smile from Lillian. "Thank you, Doctor." While the children showed Doc Sullivan the books they'd been reading, Ethan drew Lillian aside. "Doc brings news from town," he said quietly. "A man has been asking questions about a woman and 2 children. Dark-haired woman girl, about 6, boy, about 4. Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. "Victor," she whispered. "He's alive." Ethan nodded grimly. "And looking for you." The room seemed to tilt beneath Lillian's feet, her momentary peace shattered. She gripped her crutch tighter, knuckles whitening with the effort of remaining upright. "I have to leave," she said, panic rising in her voice. "Now. Today. I won't bring this danger to your home." Ethan's hand on her arm steadied her. "Listen to me. The storm has blocked the passes east. The only way out is through town, and that's the first place he'll look. Then we'll go north or south anywhere." "You'd freeze before you made 10 miles, Ethan countered firmly. "Your ankle won't carry you through deep snow, and the children wouldn't survive the journey." Tears of frustration and fear pricked at Lillian's eyes. "What choice do I have? He'll kill me this time, and God knows what he'll do to the children." "Stay," Ethan said simply. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning beyond its single syllable. Lillian stared at him in disbelief. "I can't ask that of you. You don't know Victor, what he's capable of. I know men like him." Ethan interrupted, something dark and knowing in his gaze. "And I know this land. He won't find you here unless someone leads him to us." Doc Sullivan approached, having overheard their hushed conversation. "Ethan's right, Mrs. Reed. This cabin doesn't appear on any maps, and most folks in town have forgotten it exists. It's as safe a haven as you'll find in these parts." Lillian looked between the 2 men, torn between desperate hope and bone-deep fear. "Why would you risk this? You don't even know us." Ethan's expression remained steady. "Some things don't require knowing, only doing." Before she could respond, Sarah appeared at her side, tugging gently at her skirt. "Mama, are we leaving? Is Papa coming?" Lillian knelt awkwardly, balancing on her good leg to look her daughter in the eye. "No, sweetheart. Mr. Porter has invited us to stay a little longer. Would you like that?" The girl nodded solemnly. "Yes, Thomas likes it here too. He talked today." Something in Sarah's simple acceptance broke through Lillian's fear. Her children felt safe here, perhaps for the first time in years. Could she deny them that rare gift because of her own terror? She looked up at Ethan, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She found none, only a quiet determination that somehow calmed the panic in her chest. "We'll stay," she decided finally, "until we find a safer path." Doc Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Good. I've brought extra supplies, food, medicine, warm clothing that my late wife would want put to use." He glanced at Ethan. "And I'll keep my ears open in town, let you know if our visitor makes any moves." As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Ethan aside for a private word. Lillian couldn't hear what passed between them, but she noticed the way Ethan's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening in response to whatever information was shared. After the sleigh had departed, disappearing into the sea of white that surrounded the cabin, Ethan remained on the porch for a long moment. When he returned inside, his expression was carefully neutral, but Lillian sensed a new tension in his movements. "What did he tell you?" she asked quietly, after ensuring the children were occupied with their books. Ethan hesitated, then answered with reluctant honesty. "Your husband isn't alone. He has 2 men with him, rough-looking characters, according to Doc. They're staying at the hotel in town asking questions about outlying properties." Fear coiled tighter in Lillian's stomach. 1 man she might outrun, might hide from, but 3, and armed, no doubt. The odds seemed increasingly impossible. "I've put you in terrible danger," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Ethan shook his head. You've done nothing wrong, Lillian. Nothing. The conviction in his voice sparked something in her memory, the way he had spoken on the porch the night before about knowing the difference between victim and perpetrator, about spending a lifetime learning it. "Who were you, Ethan?" she asked suddenly. "Before this cabin, before Willow Creek. Who were you running from?" The question hung between them, unexpected and penetrating. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, his expression, closed, shoulders tensing. Then something shifted in his amber eyes, a decision reached. "Not running from," he corrected softly. "Running because of." He moved to the locked room, producing a key from his pocket. After a moment's hesitation, he unlocked the door and gestured for Lillian to follow. Inside was a small bedroom meticulously preserved. A woman's shawl draped over a chair, a brush and mirror set on a simple vanity, a wedding portrait in a silver frame. "Rebecca," Ethan said, his voice different when speaking the name. "My wife." Lillian's eyes were drawn to the portrait, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, and Ethan beside her, younger, clean-shaven, wearing what appeared to be a lawman's uniform. "She was lovely," Lillian offered, understanding now what the locked room represented, a shrine, a memory preserved. "She was murdered," Ethan replied, the words falling like stones between them. 3 years ago." Lillian's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the portrait. "I was sheriff of Riverside County to the north. Rebecca discovered evidence of corruption, a trafficking ring using the railroads to transport women and children east. She was killed before she could bring the evidence to me." The revelation stunned Lillian into silence. This then was the man beneath the reclusive rancher, a lawman, a widower, a man whose life had been shattered by violence. "Did they find who did it?" she asked finally. Ethan's expression hardened. "The investigation was curtailed. Powerful interests were involved. I was encouraged to accept the official finding of a random act of violence. But you didn't." "No." The single word contained volumes of grief and determination. "I resigned my position and came here where I could continue investigating without scrutiny. 3 years of gathering evidence, building a case." Lillian absorbed this understanding now, his willingness to shelter them, his recognition of the bruises on her face, his certainty when absolving her of shame. "And now I've brought my own danger to your door," she said softly. Ethan turned to face her fully. "Perhaps it's the same danger, Lillian. The same men." She frowned, not comprehending. "Victor was many terrible things, but he was a farmer when I married him, later a drunk, a gambler, but not—" "Men like your husband often fall into debt," Ethan interrupted gently. "And debts must be paid one way or another. The trafficking ring I'm investigating uses desperate men, recruits them to provide merchandise." Lillian finished, horror dawning as pieces clicked into place. Victor's increasing desperation for money, his sudden interest in taking Sarah to visit family in Chicago, his rage when Lillian refused. "Oh, God," she whispered, reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. "That's what he wanted Sarah for. That's why." The memory crashed over her like ice water. Victor dragging Sarah from her bed in the middle of the night, the girl's terrified screams, Lillian grabbing the fire iron in desperate defense of her child. Blood, so much blood, and then running through the night with her children clutched close. "You stopped him," Ethan said, his voice steady, anchoring her to the present. "You protected your daughter. You did what any parent, any decent human being would do." Lillian's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. 3 weeks of terror, of guilt, of wondering if she was a murderess, and now this revelation that the danger was even greater than she had imagined. "What do we do now?" she asked, voice breaking. Ethan stepped closer, not touching her but offering his solid presence as comfort. We prepare, we stay vigilant, and we protect what matters most. He nodded toward the main room, where Sarah and Thomas still sat by the fire, unaware of the conversation that had just altered their mother's understanding of their peril. I won't let him take them, Lillian vowed, steel entering her voice despite her tears. I'll die first. It won't come to that, Ethan promised. You're not alone anymore, Lillian. As they returned to the main room, closing the door on Rebecca's preserved memory, something had shifted between them, a trust born of shared tragedy and common purpose. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind of tempest was gathering on the horizon, one that would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. Sarah looked up as they entered, her young face brightening. Mr. Porter, will you teach us more chess? Thomas wants to learn too. Ethan's serious expression softened as he glanced at Lillian, silently asking permission. She nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve from darker thoughts. Of course, he agreed, moving to retrieve the chess set. Every piece has its purpose, its own way of moving across the board. The key is understanding not just your own strategy, but anticipating your opponent's as well. As he set up the game, explaining each piece's movement to the children with patient detail, Lillian watched from her chair by the fire. In this moment of borrowed peace, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where safety wasn't a luxury, where trust wasn't a risk, where her children could learn chess on winter afternoons without fear shadowing their every move. A dangerous fantasy, perhaps. But as the firelight played across Ethan's features, softening the hard lines grief had carved there, Lillian found herself unwilling to relinquish it just yet. Outside, the sun began its early winter descent, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. Inside, four souls bound by circumstance and growing connection prepared for whatever would come next, be it salvation or reckoning. For now, they had this moment, this cabin, this unexpected sanctuary in the wilderness. And for Lillian Reed, who had known nothing but fear and flight for so long, it felt perilously close to hope. Morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brittle brightness that follows great storms. The world outside the cabin sparkled deceptively peaceful under its blanket of snow. Inside, Ethan moved quietly through his morning routine, stoking the fire and preparing coffee before the others woke. His mind circled restlessly around the revelations of the previous day, calculating risks and possibilities with the methodical precision that had once made him an effective lawman. Victor Reed was alive in Willow Creek and hunting for his family. 3 armed men against 1. Against those odds, Ethan's isolated cabin was both sanctuary and trap. A floorboard creaked behind him. Ethan turned to find Lillian balanced on her crutch, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes shadowed from another night of fitful sleep. "You're up early," he observed, pouring coffee into a mug for her. "I could say the same." She accepted the coffee, gratefully easing herself into a chair at the table. "I don't think I've properly slept since Boston." A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "That's a long time to go without rest." "Yes." Lillian stared into her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Ethan, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About Victor possibly being connected to the same people who killed Rebecca," he finished when she faltered. "It's a possibility, not a certainty. But if it's true, if he's part of this trafficking ring, then running won't solve anything, will it? They have resources, connections. They would find us eventually." Ethan nodded slowly, respecting her clear-eyed assessment of their situation. "Most likely." Lillian squared her shoulders, a subtle gesture of resolve that he had come to recognize in their short acquaintance. "Then We need a different strategy. You've been hunting these people for 3 years, gathering evidence, and now I'm a witness, perhaps even evidence of their operations." She met his gaze directly, something fierce and determined in her eyes. "My children and I can't keep running forever, Ethan. Sooner or later we'll falter. I want this to end." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Ethan studied her face, noting the steel beneath the exhaustion, the courage beneath the fear. In that moment, he recognized in Lillian Reed the same quality that had drawn him to Rebecca, an unwavering moral compass regardless of personal cost. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Or safe." "Nothing in my life has been easy or safe for a very long time," she replied softly. "But my children deserve better than a life spent looking over their shoulders." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah emerged from the small bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The adult conversation ended abruptly, their unspoken alliance momentarily set aside as they turned to the practicalities of breakfast and morning chores. After the meal, Ethan took Thomas with him to the barn, sensing the boy needed time away from the confines of the cabin. To his surprise, Thomas showed interest in the horses, cautiously reaching up to stroke their velvet noses after Ethan demonstrated. "I had a pony once," the boy said suddenly, his voice so quiet Ethan had to lean down to hear him. "Before Papa sold him." Ethan nodded, allowing Thomas to volunteer information at his own pace. "Horses are good judges of character," he said. "They know who to trust." Thomas considered this, his small face solemn. "Does that mean they know who's bad too?" "Usually," Ethan confirmed. "They sense fear and cruelty." The boy's dark eyes, so much older than his years, searched Ethan's face. "Papa made Mama afraid. All the time." Ethan knelt to Thomas's level, careful to move slowly. "That wasn't your Mama's fault. Or yours." "I know," Thomas whispered. "Papa was the bad one. That's why Mama had to hit him with the poker. He was going to take Sarah away." The matter-of-fact way the child described the violence he had witnessed made Ethan's chest tighten with a familiar anger, the same helpless rage he had felt standing over Rebecca's grave, while town officials muttered platitudes about random criminal acts. "Your mother is very brave," Ethan said finally. "She protected you and your sister just as a mother should." Thomas nodded, then asked with the direct simplicity of childhood, "Will you protect us from Papa, too?" The question struck Ethan like a physical blow. It had been 3 years since anyone had looked to him for protection, 3 years of solitude and silent vigilance. Yet this small boy was asking for exactly what Ethan had once sworn to provide: safety, justice, a shield against the darkness of the world. "Yes," he answered, the word a promise and a reclamation in one. "I will." Back in the cabin, they found Lillian teaching Sarah to darn a sock, the girl's tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she made careful stitches. The simple domesticity of the scene contrasted sharply with the dangers gathering beyond their walls, making Ethan all the more determined to preserve this fragile peace. "We need supplies," he announced, shrugging into his heavy coat. "I'll ride into town." Alarm flashed across Lillian's face. "Is that wise, if Victor is there?" "I've been a stranger in Willow Creek for 3 years," Ethan replied. "No one connects me to you or your children. Besides, we need information as much as supplies." After a moment's hesitation, Lillian nodded. "Be careful." "Lock the door behind me," Ethan instructed. "There's a shotgun above the mantel. Do you know how to use it?" Lillian shook her head. "Then it's time you learned." He retrieved the weapon and demonstrated how to load and fire it, impressed by her steady hands despite the fear in her eyes. "Only as a last resort," he assured her. "I'll be back before sundown." As Ethan saddled his horse, he considered the transformation of the past 4 days. His isolated existence, carefully maintained since Rebecca's death, had been irrevocably disrupted by the arrival of Lillian and her children. Yet instead of resenting their presence, he found himself dreading the eventual return to solitude. Something long dormant was awakening within him, a sense of purpose beyond vengeance, a connection to the living rather than the dead. The trail to town had been partially cleared by Doc Sullivan's sleigh the day before, making travel possible, if not comfortable. Ethan rode cautiously alert to any sign of other travelers. The wilderness stretched white and silent around him, broken only by the occasional pine standing sentinel against the blue winter sky. Willow Creek appeared on the horizon after an hour's ride, smoke rising from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. A modest settlement of perhaps 200 souls, it had grown around the stagecoach stop and lumber mill that provided its primary employment. Ethan rarely visited, preferring to order supplies through Doc Sullivan or trade with passing trappers. His periodic appearances were generally met with cautious nods rather than conversation. The town had long ago categorized him as a recluse, someone to be left to his solitude. Today, however, he needed information more than anonymity. He tethered his horse outside Vera Maxwell's general store, brushing snow from his coat before entering. The bell above the door jangled, announcing his arrival. Vera herself stood behind the counter, a plump, sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing that happened in Willow Creek. Her eyebrows rose at the sight of Ethan. "Mr. Porter," she greeted with exaggerated surprise, "twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Storm cleared my pantry faster than expected," Ethan replied, removing his hat respectfully. "Need to restock." Of course, of course." Vera bustled around the counter, already gathering items. "Heard you had quite the snowdrift out your way. Doc Sullivan mentioned he stopped by yesterday." Ethan made a non-committal sound, recognizing Vera's fishing expedition for what it was. The storekeeper continued, undeterred by his reticence. "We've had other visitors lately, too. Gentleman from back east staying at the hotel with 2 companions, looking for his runaway wife and children. Poor man." Ethan selected a bag of coffee beans, keeping his expression neutral. "That's so," Vera nodded eagerly. "Says she's not right in the head. Attacked him in a fit of madness, then took off with the little ones. He's beside himself with worry." "Sounds troubling," Ethan commented, adding flour and sugar to his growing pile of supplies. "Indeed. Mr. Reed, that's his name, Victor Reed. He's offering a reward for information, $20 to whoever helps him find his family." Vera lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Mr. Porter, I think Doc might know something he's not telling. He got mighty fidgety when Mr. Reed was asking questions yesterday." Ethan met her gaze directly. "Doc's a physician. Patient confidentiality is sacred to him." Vera blinked at his unexpected response, then recovered with a nervous laugh. "Well, of course, of course. I'm just saying if that poor man's wife is unwell, she ought to be returned to his care along with those children." "Perhaps," Ethan said, his tone carefully modulated, "there's more to the story than a concerned husband." The storekeeper stilled her curiosity, piqued by this uncharacteristic comment. "What do you mean, Mr. Porter?" "Only that appearances can be deceiving." Ethan reached for his wallet. "I'll need ammunition as well. Shotgun and rifle." Vera's expression shifted subtly, a calculating gleam entering her eyes. "Planning on hunting, are you? Winter's long," Ethan replied evenly. "Food stores need replenishing." As Vera tallied his purchases, the bell above the door rang again. Ethan tensed instinctively, though he kept his posture relaxed. 3 men entered, stamping snow from their boots, strangers, with the hard eyes and watchful posture of those accustomed to violence. The leader, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive coat, surveyed the store with the entitled gaze of someone used to commanding attention. His companions flanked him shorter but broader, with the unmistakable bulge of firearms beneath their jackets. "Mrs. Maxwell," the leader greeted smoothly. "Any news for me today?" Vera's demeanor changed instantly, her usual brusque efficiency replaced by fawning deference. "Mr. Reed, how fortunate you've come in. I was just telling Mr. Porter here about your situation." Victor Reed turned his attention to Ethan, assessing him with cold calculation. "I don't believe we've met." "Ethan Porter." Ethan introduced himself, extending his hand with deliberate calm. "I have a small ranch outside town." Reed shook his hand briefly, his grip unnecessarily firm, a small power play that Ethan noted without reaction. "Victor Reed, from Boston. I'm searching for my wife and children. Perhaps you've seen them on your property. A dark-haired woman about 28, with a girl of 6 and a boy of 4. "I haven't," Ethan lied without hesitation. "But I'll keep an eye out." Victor studied him for a moment longer as though searching for deception. "My wife is unwell. She attacked me during an episode of hysteria. I fear for my children's safety in her care." "That's troubling," Ethan replied, echoing his earlier comment to Vera. "I hope you find them soon." "I intend to." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "By any means necessary." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Ethan maintained eye contact, neither challenging nor retreating. Finally, Victor turned his attention back to Vera, dismissing Ethan as unimportant. "Mrs. Maxwell, I'd like to expand my search. Do you have maps of the surrounding area, particularly outlying properties and trail systems?" As Vera hurried to comply, Ethan gathered his purchases paid and headed for the door. The encounter had confirmed his worst suspicions. Victor Reed was dangerous, determined, and resourceful. The two men with him were clearly hired muscle, probably experienced in violence. And now they were planning to expand their search beyond the town. Time was running short. Ethan's next stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a carefully worded message to a former colleague in the U.S. Marshal's office. Without explicitly mentioning Rebecca's case or Lillian's situation, he requested information on Victor Reed of Boston and any known associates. It was a risk reaching out after 3 years of silence might draw unwanted attention, but they needed every advantage. His final destination was the Red Deer Saloon, where miners and lumberjacks gathered after their shifts. If Reed and his men had been asking questions around town, someone here would have details Vera hadn't shared. The saloon was quiet at midday, only a few regulars nursing drinks at scattered tables. Ethan nodded to the bartender, Sam Tucker, and ordered whiskey he had no intention of drinking. "Porter," Sam acknowledged, sliding the glass across the scarred wooden bar. "Been a while." "Winter keeps me busy," Ethan replied, placing a coin beside his untouched drink. "Heard we have visitors in town." Sam's eyes flicked to the coin, then back to Ethan's face. "That Boston fellow and his friends?" "Yeah, they've been around, asking lots of questions, throwing money at anyone who'll talk." "What kind of questions?" The bartender leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Started with his missing wife and kids, but it's gone beyond that. They're interested in property records, old mining claims, trail maps. One of them was asking Jimmy Dale about abandoned cabins in the high country." Ethan's blood ran cold. Jimmy Dale was a trapper who occasionally traded at Ethan's ranch. He knew exactly where the cabin was located. "Jimmy tell them anything?" Sam shook his head. "Don't think so. He clammed up when they started pressing. But they're persistent bastards, Porter. And that Reed fellow's something off about him. Cold eyes. Reminds me of a rattler before it strikes." "I noticed," Ethan murmured. Anything else I should know? The bartender hesitated, then added reluctantly, "They've been talking to Judge Crawford a lot. Private meetings at the hotel. Don't know what that's about, but Crawford's been strutting around like a rooster ever since." Judge Harlan Crawford. The name sent a surge of controlled rage through Ethan's veins. Crawford had been instrumental in shutting down the investigation into Rebecca's murder, citing lack of evidence and resources. Ethan had long suspected the judge was more than just an obstacle, that he might be actively involved in the trafficking operation. "Interesting," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral despite his churning thoughts. "Thanks, Sam." "Watch yourself, Porter," the bartender advised, his expression serious. "These aren't ordinary travelers passing through." Ethan nodded, leaving his whiskey untouched as he departed. Outside, the temperature had dropped sharply, the late afternoon sun casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered street. He mounted his horse quickly, eager to return to the cabin before nightfall brought increased danger. As he rode past the hotel, a movement caught his eye. Victor Reed stood on the porch deep in conversation with Judge Crawford. The older man nodded seriously at whatever Reed was saying, then handed him what appeared to be a document. They shook hands, the gesture formal and businesslike. Ethan continued without slowing, but his mind was racing. The connection between Reed and Crawford confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a husband searching for his runaway wife. This was something more organized, more sinister. And if Crawford was involved, it meant the corruption reached into the highest levels of local authority. The ride back to the cabin seemed interminable, each mile increasing Ethan's urgency. The sun began its early winter descent, shadows lengthening across the pristine snow. By the time he reached the familiar clearing, twilight had deepened the blue-white landscape into indigo. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed behind frosted windows, signs of life and warmth that Ethan had never particularly noticed before Lillian and her children arrived. Now the sight eased something tight in his chest. He dismounted quickly, leading his horse to the barn. After unsaddling and ensuring the animal had feed and water, Ethan gathered his supplies and approached the cabin. Before he could knock, the door flew open to reveal Sarah, her small face alight with relief. "Mr. Porter's back, Mama," she called over her shoulder. "I told you he would come before dark." Behind her, Lillian appeared, shotgun in hand, which she quickly set aside upon confirming it was indeed Ethan at the door. The simple fact that she had been prepared to defend her children if necessary stirred an unexpected warmth in him. "You had us worried," Lillian said, ushering him inside and taking some of the packages from his arms. "The sun was setting, and I thought—" "I'm sorry," Ethan interrupted gently. "I needed more information than I expected." Thomas approached shyly, reaching for one of the smaller packages. "Can I help?" "Thank you," Ethan said, allowing the boy to carry a bag of sugar to the kitchen area. He noted with approval that Lillian had kept the fire well tended in his absence, and a pot of what smelled like rabbit stew simmered on the stove. "You've been busy," he observed. Lillian nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I wanted to contribute something. We found vegetables in your root cellar, and Sarah snared a rabbit quite skillfully, I might add." "Papa taught me before he got mean," Sarah explained matter-of-factly, helping Thomas put away the supplies. "I remember how." The casual mention of Victor sent a shadow across Lillian's face. She turned to Ethan, her expression questioning. He gave a subtle shake of his head, not in front of the children. After supper, when Sarah and Thomas were occupied with a game of checkers Ethan had fashioned from spare buttons and a drawn board, he finally had an opportunity to speak privately with Lillian. They sat at the far end of the table, voices low. "Victor was in town," Ethan confirmed, "with 2 men hired help, armed and experienced." Lillian's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. Did he recognize you or make the connection? I don't think so, but he's expanding his search beyond the town limits. And there's more. Ethan leaned closer. He's working with Judge Crawford, the man I suspect was involved in covering up Rebecca's murder. Understanding dawned in Lillian's eyes. Then it's true. The connection between Victor and the trafficking ring. It appears so. Ethan recounted his observations and the information Sam had shared. They're looking at property records and trail maps. It won't be long before they narrow their search to this area. What do we do? Lillian asked, her voice steady, despite the fear evident in her eyes. We have options, Ethan replied. None perfect, all risky. Tell me. First option, you and the children leave immediately. I have a friend in Helena, a former deputy who would shelter you while I gather more evidence against Reed and Crawford. Lillian considered this, then shook her head. If these men are as connected as you say, nowhere is truly safe. And I won't spend my life running, dragging my children from one hideout to another. I thought you might say that, Ethan acknowledged. Second option, we stay here, fortify the cabin, and prepare for them to find us eventually. A siege, Lillian frowned. 3 armed men against 1 with children to protect. Not ideal, Ethan agreed grimly. Which brings us to the third option. We gather what evidence we have, your testimony about Victor's intentions for Sarah, my documentation of the trafficking operation, and take it directly to the federal marshal in Helena. Bypassing the local authorities entirely, Lillian nodded slowly. But that means traveling through winter conditions with Victor and his men, potentially watching the trails. Yes, but if we succeed, it ends for both of us. Victor goes to prison, Crawford is investigated, and the trafficking ring loses its protection. Ethan paused. You and your children would be free to build a new life without looking over your shoulder. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Across the room, Sarah laughed at something Thomas said, a bright, unguarded sound that highlighted the stakes of their decision. When would we leave? Lillian asked finally. 2 days, Ethan answered. We need time to prepare, and I'm waiting on information from my contact in the marshal's office. The telegraph should come tomorrow or the next day. Lillian nodded, decision made. 2 days then. In the meantime, I think I should learn how to shoot properly, not just loading and unloading a shotgun. Ethan studied her, noting the resolve in her posture, the quiet strength that had carried her through unimaginable hardship. We'll start tomorrow. That night, after the children were asleep, Ethan found Lillian on the porch despite the biting cold. She stood wrapped in a blanket, staring at the star-filled sky, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. You should be resting your ankle, he said, joining her. It's healing, she replied, shifting her weight slightly to demonstrate. Another day or 2, and I won't need the crutch. Silence fell between them, comfortable despite the gravity of their situation. Ethan watched as Lillian tilted her head back, taking in the vast canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the crystal-clear mountain air. In Boston, you could never see so many stars, she murmured. The city lights and coal smoke obscured all but the brightest. Out here, there's nothing between you and the universe, Ethan agreed. It can make a person feel very small. Or very free. Lillian turned to face him, her expression earnest in the faint light spilling from the cabin windows. Ethan, if this goes wrong, if something happens to me, promise me you'll take care of Sarah and Thomas. The request caught him off guard. Lillian, please, she interrupted. I need to know they'll be safe, that they won't end up in an orphanage or worse, back with Victor if he somehow evades justice. Ethan felt the weight of her trust like a physical thing, both burden and gift. 3 years of solitude had not prepared him for this moment. This woman asking him to become guardian to her children should fate turn against them. "I promise," he said finally, the words a sacred vow. "But it won't come to that. We'll both see this through." Lillian nodded, accepting his determination as genuine, even if the outcome remained uncertain. "Thank you." A cold gust of wind swept across the porch, making Lillian shiver despite her blanket. Ethan resisted the impulse to draw her closer to offer the warmth of his body against the winter chill. Instead, he opened the cabin door. "Come inside," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." True to his word, Ethan began Lillian's shooting lessons the following morning. After breakfast, they left the children with books and puzzles, venturing just far enough from the cabin for safety while remaining within sight of the windows. "The rifle has more kick than the shotgun," Ethan explained, demonstrating the proper stance and grip. "But it's more accurate at distance, which is what we need." Lillian listened intently, absorbing his instructions with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything. When he handed her the rifle, she held it with appropriate respect for its deadly potential. "Sight along the barrel," he guided, standing close behind her. "Breathe in, then exhale slowly as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull, squeeze." Her first shot went wide of the target, a can placed on a fence post 30 yards away, but her form was good. By the fifth attempt, she had found her rhythm, hitting the target with increasingly consistent accuracy. "You're a natural," Ethan observed, impressed by her rapid progress. Lillian lowered the rifle, a mix of pride and somber reflection in her expression. "I never imagined I'd learn to shoot. In Boston, I taught literature and French to young ladies who would faint at the sight of a gun." "Life takes unexpected turns," Ethan said quietly. "We adapt, or we perish." "Yes." Lillian raised the rifle again, sighting her target with new determination. "And I have no intention of perishing." They continued practicing until Lillian's arms trembled with fatigue and her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. Still, she had managed to hit the target more often than not enough to defend herself and her children if necessary. As they walked back to the cabin, Ethan found himself studying Lillian's profile against the winter landscape. The woman who had collapsed at his door 4 days ago, broken and desperate, had transformed before his eyes. There was steel in her now, or perhaps it had always been there, merely tempered further by necessity. Inside, they found Sarah teaching Thomas a clapping game, their laughter a welcome counterpoint to the morning's serious work. Lillian immediately moved to join them, her face softening as she knelt awkwardly beside her children. Ethan busied himself with preparing lunch, his thoughts turning to practical matters. The journey to Helena would take 3 days by horseback, in good conditions, longer with children and winter weather. They would need provisions, warm clothing, weapons, and they would need to travel without being spotted by Reed or his men, who were likely already expanding their search beyond Willow Creek. A knock at the door froze everyone mid-movement. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm, and Thomas instinctively pressed closer to his mother. Ethan motioned for them to remain silent as he retrieved his shotgun from beside the fireplace. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself strategically beside the door rather than in front of it. "Doc Sullivan," came the familiar voice. "Got that medicine you asked for Porter?" Ethan relaxed marginally, but remained cautious as he opened the door, shotgun still in hand. The old doctor stood alone on the porch, his medical bag in one hand and a small package in the other. "You can lower that scattergun," Doc said dryly. "Unless you're expecting trouble." "Always expecting trouble these days," Ethan replied, stepping aside to let the physician enter. "Any sign of being followed?" Doc shook his head. Took the long way around just to be sure. But they're getting closer, Ethan. Reed and his men were asking Jimmy Dale about cabins in this area yesterday. Did he tell them? Jimmy's no fool. Said he didn't know of any permanent structures this far out. Doc set his bag on the table, nodding a greeting to Lillian and the children. But they're persistent. And now they've got the law on their side. Lillian's head snapped up. What do you mean? Doc's expression was grim. Judge Crawford issued a warrant this morning for your arrest, Mrs. Reed. Charges of attempted murder and kidnapping. Reed convinced him you're mentally unstable and a danger to your own children. The color drained from Lillian's face. That's absurd. Victor was the one who— I know, Doc interrupted gently. But Crawford's word is law in Willow Creek, and he's firmly in Reed's pocket. They've deputized Reed's men to execute the warrant, giving them legal authority to search any property in the county. Ethan cursed under his breath. How much time do we have? A day, maybe two. They're organizing a search party, local men who know the backcountry. Doc reached into his coat, producing a folded paper. This came for you at the telegraph office. I took the liberty of collecting it before Reed or his men could see it. Ethan took the telegram, reading it quickly. His contact in the marshal's office had come through with information. Victor Reed was, indeed, connected to a known trafficking operation that moved women and children east via the railroads. He had accumulated gambling debts to the organization and was working off what he owed by providing merchandise and local intelligence. We need to move sooner than planned, Ethan said, passing the telegram to Lillian. Tonight, if possible. Doc nodded in agreement. I can take the children in my sleigh, less conspicuous than all of you traveling together. Meet you at the old mining camp near Baker's Ridge. Lillian looked up from the telegram, her face pale but resolved. No, we stay together. Lillian, Ethan began, it might be safer. I will not be separated from my children, she interrupted firmly. Not for a moment. We've come this far together. We'll continue together. After a brief hesitation, Ethan nodded. All right, but we leave at nightfall. Doc, can you create a distraction in town? Something to keep Reed and his men occupied for a few hours? The physician's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. I believe Mrs. Thornton's prize mare is due to foal any day. A false alarm would certainly draw attention. Half the town would gather to witness the blessed event. Perfect, Ethan said, the beginnings of a plan taking shape in his mind. We'll take the North Trail to Helena, avoiding the main road entirely. I'll bring supplies to Baker's Ridge at midnight, Doc promised. Extra food, blankets, medicines, and this— He reached into his bag and produced a small revolver which he handed to Lillian. Easier to handle than a rifle or shotgun, especially if you're on horseback with a child. Lillian accepted the weapon with a solemn nod of thanks. Sarah and Thomas watched the exchange with wide, frightened eyes, understanding enough to know that danger was approaching. Are the bad men coming, Mama? Sarah asked, her small voice steady despite her fear. Lillian knelt beside her children, gathering them close. We're going on a journey tonight, she explained calmly. A secret journey to find people who will help us. Mr. Porter and Doc Sullivan are going to keep us safe. Like an adventure? Thomas asked hesitantly. Yes, like an adventure, Lillian confirmed, forcing a smile. But a quiet one. We'll need to be very brave and very silent, like rabbits in the forest. The children nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the resilience of the very young. Ethan watched the interaction with a mixture of admiration and concern. They were involving children in a dangerous flight from armed men, but what choice did they have? The alternative was unthinkable. Doc Sullivan departed soon after, promising to create his distraction at sundown and meet them later at Baker's Ridge. Ethan and Lillian spent the remainder of the day in focused preparation, gathering supplies, planning their route, ensuring the children were warmly dressed in layers. As twilight approached, Ethan found himself drawn to Rebecca's room one final time. He unlocked the door quietly, slipping inside without Lillian or the children noticing. The preserved shrine to his late wife remained exactly as it had for 3 years, untouched, unchanging, a monument to grief and unfinished justice. He lifted the wedding portrait, tracing Rebecca's smile with a gentle finger. "I'm close," he whispered to the image. "Closer than I've ever been to the truth, to making it right." With careful reverence, he removed the false bottom of the dresser drawer where he had stored all his evidence notes, witness statements, financial records, tracing the trafficking operation back to Judge Crawford and his associates. 3 years of painstaking investigation gathered at great personal risk. "I have to leave this place," he told Rebecca's portrait, "but I'm taking you with me. In here," he touched his heart, "and in this." He indicated the leather portfolio of evidence. For the first time since her death, Ethan felt something shift within him, not an abandonment of his quest for justice, but a broadening of purpose. Rebecca would always be part of him, but perhaps there was room for something more. For healing, alongside vengeance, for future, alongside past. He returned the portrait to its place on the bedside table, a final goodbye to the shrine, but not to the woman it honored. Then he gathered his evidence and quietly closed the door behind him. In the main room, Lillian was helping Sarah into a thick woolen coat, while Thomas struggled with his boots. The domestic scene struck Ethan with unexpected force, this makeshift family preparing for a dangerous journey, their trust in him both gift and burden. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Lillian looked up, something in her expression, suggesting she understood the deeper meaning of his question, that he was asking about more than just their imminent departure. "Yes," she answered simply. "We're ready." Outside, night had fallen completely. The new moon provided little illumination, which suited their purposes perfectly. Ethan had prepared the horses earlier, his sturdy gelding for himself, and Lillian's smaller mare borrowed from a neighbor months ago and never returned for the children. They would ride double Sarah with Ethan and Thomas with his mother, at least until they reached Baker's Ridge, where Doc Sullivan would meet them with additional mounts. "Remember," Ethan instructed, as they prepared to leave the cabin, "absolute silence until we're well away. If we're separated, continue north to Baker's Ridge. Doc will be waiting at midnight." Lillian nodded, adjusting Thomas in front of her on the saddle. Her ankle was healing, but still tender. Ethan had fashioned a more secure wrapping to support it during their ride. With a final glance at the cabin, his home and hermitage for 3 years, Ethan turned his horse toward the northern trail. Behind him, Lillian followed silently, one arm securely around Thomas, while the other held the reins. Sarah sat before Ethan, small and warm against his chest, her honey-brown hair tickling his chin as they rode. The night embraced them, the horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow as they left the clearing and entered the sheltering forest. Stars glittered overhead through gaps in the pine branches, cold and distant witnesses to their flight. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, the possibility of justice or further heartbreak. Behind them, the cabin stood empty and dark smoke no longer rising from its chimney, an abandoned sanctuary in a wilderness that had never been truly safe. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following game trails that wound through dense forest, avoiding the more obvious paths. Ethan led the way, his woodsman's instinct and lawman's caution guiding them through the darkness. The children remained remarkably quiet, seeming to understand the gravity of their situation despite their young ages. When they paused to rest the horses in a small clearing, Sarah tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Porter," she whispered so quietly he had to bend down to hear her. "I'm not scared." Something in her solemn declaration, the bravery of a child facing adult dangers, tightened Ethan's throat with emotion he hadn't expected. "That's good," he whispered back. "But it's all right if you are. Sometimes being brave means doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared." Sarah considered this, then nodded sagely. "Like Mama, when she hit Papa with the poker." "Yes," Ethan confirmed, glancing at Lillian, who was helping Thomas take a drink from their canteen. "Exactly like that." They continued their journey, the forest growing denser around them, as they climbed steadily toward Baker's Ridge. According to Ethan's pocket watch, it was approaching 11. They would reach the rendezvous point with Doc Sullivan, with time to spare. The first sign of trouble came suddenly, the distant sound of men's voices carried on the still night air. Ethan raised his hand, signaling for Lillian to halt. They sat motionless on their horses, straining to listen. "Tracks heading north," a voice echoed faintly. "Fresh couldn't be more than an hour old." "Reed said the Porter cabin was empty," another voice responded. "Must have fled when they heard we were coming." Ethan cursed silently. They had been discovered sooner than expected, their trail already found, despite their caution. He signaled to Lillian, pointing west toward a denser section of forest. They would need to change direction, throw off their pursuers. As they turned their horses, Thomas's foot accidentally dislodged a branch from a snowdrift. It fell with a soft thump, barely audible to Ethan's ears, but in the frozen night, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Did you hear that?" The distant voice became more alert. "Over there." "Ride," Ethan mouthed to Lillian, spurring his horse forward. "Now!" They abandoned stealth for speed horses, plunging through snowdrifts and between trees, branches, whipping past their faces in the darkness. Behind them, shouts grew louder as their pursuers gave chase. Sarah clung to Ethan's coat, her small body tense but silent as they galloped through the forest. Ethan kept Lillian's horse in sight, relieved to see she was keeping pace, despite the awkwardness of riding with Thomas and her injured ankle. The sound of a rifle shot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering bark from a tree near Ethan's head. He ducked instinctively, pulling Sarah closer against him. "Hold tight," he instructed, urging his horse to greater speed. They broke from the forest onto a moonlit slope, Baker's Ridge rising before them, the old mining camp visible as dark shapes against the snow. No sign of Doc Sullivan yet, but they were early, and the physician might be delayed by his distraction in town. Another shot rang out closer this time. Ethan made a split-second decision, reining his horse sharply right toward a tumble of boulders that would provide cover. "Follow me," he called to Lillian, abandoning whispers now that they had been discovered. They reached the rocks just as more gunfire erupted behind them. Ethan dismounted quickly, lifting Sarah down before reaching for his rifle. "Stay behind the rocks," he instructed, helping Lillian and Thomas dismount. "I'll hold them off until Doc arrives." Lillian's face was pale but determined in the faint moonlight. She drew the revolver Doc had given her, checking it with steady hands. "We'll hold them off together," she corrected. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of understanding, of shared purpose that transcended words. Then Ethan turned his attention to their pursuers, who had emerged from the forest and were approaching cautiously across the open slope. He counted 3 figures on horseback, Reed and his 2 men, just as expected. They had spread out, making themselves harder targets as they advanced. "That's far enough," Ethan called his voice, carrying clearly in the cold air. "Turn back now, Porter." Victor Reed's voice registered surprise, then understanding. "So you're the one harboring my wife and children? That's a mistake you'll regret." "Your wife has quite a different story," Ethan replied, keeping his rifle trained on the central figure. "About your plans for your daughter, about what kind of man you really are." A harsh laugh echoed across the snow. "And you believe the ravings of a hysterical woman Lillian has always been unstable, prone to delusions and fits of violence. Why, look what she did to me." Reed gestured to his head where Ethan could make out a bandage visible even in the dim light. "I've seen her bruises," Ethan countered, "and I know about your connection to Judge Crawford and his trafficking operation." This statement was met with momentary silence, followed by a colder, more calculated response from Reed. "You're interfering in matters beyond your understanding, Porter. Hand over my wife and children, and perhaps you'll walk away from this." "Never," Ethan stated flatly. "Now, turn around and ride back to Willow Creek. Tell Crawford his operation is finished. I have evidence enough to bring federal marshals down on all of you." Reed's posture changed, becoming more aggressive. He signaled to his companions, who began to fan out further, attempting to circle around the rocky outcropping. "Last chance, Porter," Reed called, "or this ends badly for all of you." Ethan's response was a warning shot that kicked up snow inches from Reed's horse, making the animal rear in alarm. "Next one won't miss," he promised. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, the winter night holding its breath around them. In the distance, Ethan thought he heard sleigh bells, Doc Sullivan approaching at last, but they seemed too far away to offer immediate help. Beside him, Lillian whispered urgently, "Ethan, the children." Before she could finish, one of Reed's men fired the bullet, ricocheting off the rocks above their heads. Ethan returned fire immediately, his shot finding its mark. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell from his horse. The night erupted into chaos. Reed and his remaining men charged forward, firing rapidly. Ethan pushed Lillian and the children deeper into the shelter of the rocks, returning fire with calculated precision, despite the poor light. A bullet grazed his arm, tearing through coat and flesh with a burning sting. He ignored the pain, chambering another round, as Reed's second man fell leg-wounded. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted to Lillian, who was shielding the children with her body, while keeping her revolver aimed at the approaching danger. Victor Reed had dismounted and was moving from rock to rock, using the terrain for cover as he worked his way closer. His voice carried through the gunfire, taunting and cold. "Lillian, you think this man will protect you, like you thought I would when you married me?" A harsh laugh. "You belong to me. The children belong to me. It's the law." "The law doesn't permit what you planned for Sarah," Lillian called back, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're a monster, Victor, and I'll die before I let you near my children again."
"That can be arranged,"
Reed snarled, suddenly much closer than Ethan had realized. A shot rang out from Lillian's position. Reed cursed, but the bullet had only creased his coat. He returned fire, forcing Lillian to duck behind a boulder. Ethan moved carefully, trying to get a clear line of sight on Reed without exposing himself. The sleigh bells were definitely closer now, Doc Sullivan approaching at speed, but they still needed to survive the next few minutes. In the pale moonlight, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement. Sarah had broken from Lillian's protection and was running toward the forest edge. "Sarah!" Lillian's desperate cry pierced the night. Reed saw the child too. With surprising speed, he lunged from his position, grabbing the girl before she could reach the trees. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through Ethan like a physical blow. "Drop your weapons!" Reed shouted, holding Sarah in front of him with one arm while pressing his pistol to her small head with the other. "Or I'll kill her right now." Time seemed to stop. Ethan froze, rifle half-raised, caught in an impossible choice. Beside him, Lillian made a strangled sound of maternal anguish, her revolver trembling in her hand. Please, she begged, all pretense of strength gone from her voice. Victor, please. She's your daughter. She's merchandise, Reed replied coldly, worth more to me sold than kept. Now, drop your weapons. In that moment, looking at Sarah's terrified face and Reed's cruel smile, Ethan understood with perfect clarity that this man would never let any of them live, regardless of what they did next. Reed had recognized Ethan as a threat to the entire operation, a witness who could bring down Crawford and everyone connected to him. As if confirming this realization, Reed continued, "Once you're disarmed, Mrs. Reed will watch as I dispose of her gallant protector. Then she and the boy will have an unfortunate accident on the way back to town. Tragic, but not surprising given her unstable condition." "You won't get away with this," Ethan said, playing for time, as he assessed their options. "Doc Sullivan is on his way. He knows everything." "The old fool," Reed laughed. "Crawford will handle him. Now, throw down your weapons, or the girl dies first." Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face as the cold metal of Reed's pistol pressed against her temple. The sight ignited something primal in Ethan, a protective fury he hadn't felt since finding Rebecca's body 3 years before. In that frozen moment, with Sarah's life hanging by a thread and darkness closing in around them, Ethan locked eyes with Lillian. Some unspoken communication passed between them, a plan formed without words, a desperate gamble born of shared determination. Ethan slowly lowered his rifle as if complying with Reed's demand. "All right," he said, voice steady. "Let the child go, and we'll surrender." Reed's smile was triumphant cruel. "Throw it away first. Both of you weapons on the ground now." As Ethan bent to place his rifle in the snow, he caught Lillian's slight nod. In one fluid motion, he dropped to one knee, leaving Reed's line of sight clear to where Thomas stood partially concealed behind a rock. The boy's small hands held Lillian's revolver steadied against the stone, exactly as Ethan had taught his mother earlier that day. His eyes were wide with fear, but focused with extraordinary determination for one so young. The shot that rang out in the winter night came not from Reed's pistol, nor from Ethan's rifle, but from the revolver in Thomas's tiny hands. The bullet caught Reed in the shoulder of his gun arm, not a killing shot, but enough to make him release Sarah and stagger backward with a howl of pain and shock. Ethan moved instantly, lunging forward to grab Sarah while bringing his rifle back up in one smooth motion. Lillian rushed to Thomas, gathering him in her arms as the revolver fell from his shaking hands into the snow. Reed recovered quickly despite his wound, raising his pistol with his uninjured arm. His face was contorted with rage and disbelief. "You taught the boy to shoot me, my own son." Before he could fire, Ethan's rifle cracked the bullet, finding its mark with deadly accuracy. Victor Reed fell backward into the snow, a look of permanent surprise frozen on his face as his life's blood spread in a dark stain beneath him. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were Sarah's sobs and the approaching jingle of sleigh bells as Doc Sullivan finally arrived at the scene. The doctor took in the situation with one comprehensive glance, the wounded men groaning in the snow, Reed's motionless body, Ethan standing protectively near Lillian and her children. "My God," Doc murmured, pulling his sleigh to a halt. "Are you all right?" Ethan looked to Lillian, who was kneeling in the snow with both children clutched tightly to her chest. Her face was pale with shock, but her eyes held a fierce relief that mirrored his own feelings. "We survived," Ethan answered simply. "That's enough for now." As Doc Sullivan began tending to the wounded men, Reed's hired guns would face justice, rather than death. Ethan approached Lillian and the children. He knelt beside them, his hand gentle on Sarah's trembling shoulder. "You were very brave," he told the girl softly. "Running was smart. It gave your brother a clear shot." Sarah looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I remembered what you said about being brave, even when you're scared." Thomas remained silent, his small face buried against his mother's neck. The enormity of what the boy had done, firing a gun, wounding his own father to save his sister, would require careful healing in the days and weeks to come. Lillian met Ethan's gaze over her children's heads, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Is it over?" She asked the question, encompassing far more than just the immediate danger. Ethan glanced toward Reed's still form, then back to the woman and children who had irrevocably changed his solitary existence. "This part is over," he confirmed. "But we still have work to do in Helena evidence, to present statements to give. Crawford and his operation won't fall easily." Lillian nodded, understanding the road ahead remained challenging. "But we'll face it together." The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning beyond their immediate circumstances, a tentative reaching toward possibility, toward future rather than past. Together, Ethan agreed the word both promise and hope. Behind them, Doc Sullivan approached, medical bag in hand. "The sleigh is ready," he announced. "We should move quickly. These men need proper medical attention, and you all need to get out of this cold." Ethan helped Lillian to her feet, noting how she winced as she put weight on her injured ankle. Without hesitation, he lifted Thomas into his arms, allowing Lillian to focus on supporting Sarah. As they walked toward the waiting sleigh, the first light of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon. The night's darkness was receding, giving way to the pale promise of a new day. A fitting metaphor, Ethan thought, for what they had just survived and what lay ahead. The journey to Helena would be long, and not without its own challenges. Crawford would fight back when he discovered what had happened. The trafficking operation had powerful protectors who wouldn't surrender easily. Justice for Rebecca, and now for Lillian and her children, remained an uphill battle. Yet as they settled into the sleigh blankets wrapped around them for warmth, Ethan found himself experiencing something he had almost forgotten: hope. Not just for justice, but for healing, for connection, for the possibility of building something new from the broken pieces of the past. Lillian's hand found his beneath the blankets, her fingers cold, but her grip steady. No words were necessary as Doc Sullivan urged the horses forward, carrying them away from the scene of violence toward whatever future awaited. Behind them, the rising sun began to paint Baker's Ridge in gold and rose, transforming the blood-stained snow into a canvas of light. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility, and for now, that was enough. Dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold as Doc Sullivan's sleigh carried them away from the bloody scene at Baker's Ridge. Ethan sat vigilant, rifle across his knees, scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Beside him, Lillian held her children close, both youngsters finally succumbing to exhaustion after the night's horrors. "Thomas hasn't spoken since it happened," Lillian whispered, stroking her son's dark hair as he slept against her shoulder. Worry creased her brow. "He shot his own father, Ethan." "To save his sister," Ethan reminded her gently. "Remember that. What he did was brave beyond his years." "He's only 4, Lillian's voice broke. "No child should have to carry such a burden." Ethan had no answer for this truth. Instead, he reached across the space between them, his gloved hand covering hers in silent support. The gesture said what words could not, that he understood the weight of violence, how it marked the soul regardless of justification. "We'll need to stop soon," Doc Sullivan called over his shoulder, breaking into their private moment. "Horses need rest, and you all need proper food and warmth." "How far to Helena?" Ethan asked. "2 days by sleigh in these conditions," the physician replied. "I know a place about 10 miles ahead. Old trapper's cabin, abandoned now, but still sound. We can shelter there until nightfall." Ethan nodded approval. Traveling by day increased their visibility, but the children needed proper rest after the night's trauma. The immediate danger, Victor Reed, was eliminated, but Judge Crawford would soon learn of his associate's death. The corrupt official had too much to lose to let them reach the federal marshals in Helena without interference. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled dense pine forest, giving way to more open terrain. The winter sun climbed higher, its cold light glittering across unbroken snow. In the distance, the jagged silhouette of mountains promised both shelter and challenge. When they reached the trapper's cabin, Ethan surveyed it with a lawman's caution before allowing the others inside. The structure was weathered but intact, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and sleeping platform built against one wall. "It's not much," Doc Sullivan apologized as he helped Lillian down from the sleigh, "but it'll keep you warm while I return to Willow Creek." Lillian's head snapped up in alarm. "Return, is that wise?" The physician's expression was grim beneath his frosted beard. "Necessary, I'm afraid. Crawford needs to believe you're heading east, not northwest, to Helena. I'll spread word that I treated a wounded woman and 2 children on the Eastern Trail, should buy you some time." Ethan clasped the older man's shoulder. "It's a risk, Doc." "Calculated one," Sullivan replied with a shrug. "Crawford thinks I'm just a harmless old sawbones. Besides, someone needs to tend those wounded men you left behind." He cast a meaningful glance toward the still sleeping children. "And young Thomas needs this." From his medical bag, Doc withdrew a small brown bottle. "Laudanum," he explained, handing it to Lillian. "Just a few drops if the nightmares come. Child's seen too much for his years." "Thank you," Lillian whispered, clutching the bottle like a lifeline, after helping unload provisions from the sleigh Doc prepared to depart. "I'll meet you at Miner's Pass tomorrow night," he instructed, pointing to a spot on the map Ethan had spread across the table. "From there, it's a straight shot to Helena." As the physician's sleigh disappeared into the distance, Ethan turned his attention to making the cabin habitable. He built a fire while Lillian prepared a simple meal from their supplies. Sarah woke hungry and subdued, but Thomas remained deeply asleep, his small face troubled even in repose. "He's exhausted," Lillian murmured, placing a cool hand on her son's forehead. "Let him sleep as long as he needs." The day passed in quiet industry. Ethan repaired a broken window shutter, reinforced the door, and prepared the horses for the night's journey. Lillian tended to the children, mended clothing torn during their flight, and organized their meager provisions. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who had known each other far longer than a mere 5 days. As evening approached, Thomas finally stirred. The boy sat up slowly, disoriented, his dark eyes moving from his mother to Ethan to the unfamiliar surroundings. "Papa," he whispered, the single word laden with confusion and nascent guilt. Lillian was at his side, instantly gathering him into her arms. "You're safe, Thomas. We're all safe because of you." The boy's shoulders began to shake, silent sobs racking his small frame. Ethan turned away, giving them privacy in their grief and relief. Through the cabin's single window, he watched darkness gathering among the trees, shadows lengthening across virgin snow. His thoughts turned to Rebecca, what she would think of these developments, of the woman and children who had upended his solitary existence. "She would approve," he murmured to himself, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. Rebecca had possessed a boundless capacity for compassion, for recognizing injustice and standing against it. She would have welcomed Lillian and her children without hesitation. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. Ethan looked down to find Thomas standing beside him, eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Are you a sheriff?" the boy asked quietly. Ethan knelt to his level. "I was once." "Sheriffs protect people," Thomas stated with childish certainty. "They try to," Ethan agreed cautiously, unsure where this conversation was leading. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his young face solemn with thoughts too complex for his years. Finally he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I protected Sarah." The simple statement carried the weight of the boy's confusion, his need for reassurance that what he had done was right, despite the terrible finality of it. Ethan recognized the moment for what it was, a child seeking absolution, understanding a moral compass, in a world suddenly rendered incomprehensible. "Yes," Ethan confirmed, his tone gentle but firm. "You protected your sister when she was in danger. That's what brave people do. They protect those who can't protect themselves. Even if it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Ethan hesitated, then continued carefully. "Thomas, what happened wasn't your fault. Your father made bad choices that put Sarah in danger. You did what you had to do, just like your mother did when she protected both of you back in Boston." The boy considered this, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Will I have bad dreams?" The question caught Ethan off guard with its simple insight. "You might," he acknowledged honestly. "I did after the war, after other things. But they get better with time, and you're not alone with them." Thomas nodded solemnly, seemingly satisfied with this answer. He glanced back toward his mother and sister, then surprised Ethan by slipping his small hand into the man's larger one. "I'm hungry," he announced. The ordinary statement after such a profound conversation made something twist in Ethan's chest. The resilience of children, their ability to encompass trauma and hunger, profound moral questions, and simple physical needs, all in the same moment, never ceased to amaze him. "Then let's get you fed," he replied, allowing Thomas to lead him back to the center of the cabin where Lillian was preparing their evening meal. The look of grateful wonder on Lillian's face when she saw her son holding Ethan's hand, speaking and engaged with the world again, was something Ethan knew he would remember for the rest of his days. They ate quietly, conserving energy for the night's journey ahead. As darkness fell completely outside, Ethan went to prepare the horses, while Lillian bundled the children in every layer of clothing they possessed. The temperature had dropped sharply, the night air crystalline with cold. "We travel light and fast," Ethan instructed when he returned. "Doc's distraction should keep Crawford's men looking east. But we can't take chances. If we're separated, continue to Miners Pass. Doc will find you." Lillian nodded, her expression determined, despite the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. The sprained ankle that had brought her to his doorstep just days before had healed enough for her to walk without the crutch, though she still favored it slightly. They extinguished the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness before venturing outside. The night was clear and star-filled, the half-moon casting enough light to see by without making them easy targets. Ethan helped Sarah onto his horse, then lifted Thomas up behind his sister. "Hold tight to each other," he instructed. "Lillian, can you ride alone?" She nodded, already mounting the second horse with surprising grace despite her injury. "Boston ladies are taught to ride from childhood," she explained, seeing his expression, though side saddle was preferred to this. Ethan allowed himself a brief smile before turning serious again. "We ride west until dawn, then north through Carter's Gulch. Less chance of being spotted there." They set off at a steady pace, the horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow. The night embraced them, the vast Montana wilderness spreading around them like a frozen ocean, indifferent to the human drama unfolding across its surface. They rode mostly in silence, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or allow the children a brief respite from the cold. Thomas and Sarah remained remarkably stoic throughout the journey, huddling together for warmth, accepting water and dried meat with whispered thanks when Ethan offered it. Ethan, here. Lillian rode beside him, her face illuminated by starlight, occasionally wincing when her horse's movement jostled her healing ankle. Once, when they paused at a frozen stream to water the horses, she spoke quietly. "I never thanked you properly." Ethan looked up from where he was breaking ice for the animals to drink. "For what?" "For believing me," Lillian replied simply. "When I arrived at your door, you could have turned us away. Most would have. Yet you took us in, protected us, risked your life." She trailed off, seemingly unable to find words adequate to express her gratitude. "You would have done the same," Ethan said after a moment. It wasn't a question but a statement of certainty. Lillian smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but that doesn't diminish what you've done for us." She hesitated, then added softly, "For me." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility, with emotions too new and fragile to name. Ethan found himself stepping closer to her, drawn by some force as inevitable as gravity. "Lillian, A distant sound interrupted whatever he might have said, the unmistakable rhythm of horses at a gallop approaching from the east. Ethan tensed, immediately alert to the danger. "Riders," he said tersely. "At least 3 moving fast." Lillian's face paled in the moonlight. "Crawford's men? Most likely. We need to move now." They mounted quickly, Ethan lifting the children onto his horse before swinging up behind them. There was no time for caution or comfort. Speed was their only advantage now. "Stay close," he instructed Lillian. "We'll head for the ravine, lose them in the rocks." They urged their horses forward, leaving the frozen stream behind as they plunged into denser forest. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Their hunters had picked up their trail and were gaining ground. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous. Roots and rocks hidden beneath snow threatened to lame their mounts with each stride. Ahead, the dark mouth of the ravine promised temporary shelter, a chance to evade their pursuers in its twisted passages. They had almost reached it when a rifle shot cracked through the night air. Lillian's horse screamed, stumbling as the bullet found its mark in the animal's flank. She managed to kick free as the horse fell, landing hard in the snow beside the wounded animal. "Mama!" Sarah cried, reaching back toward her mother. Ethan reined in, sharply torn between the need to get the children to safety and the impossibility of leaving Lillian behind. "Go!" Lillian shouted, scrambling to her feet despite her injured ankle. "Get the children to the ravine!" Another shot whistled past them, too close for comfort. Their pursuers had spotted them in the moonlight reflecting off the open snow. Ethan made his decision in an instant. "Hold tight," he instructed the children, then spurred his horse toward Lillian. As he drew alongside, he reached down, catching her outstretched arm and hauling her up behind him in one fluid motion. The horse protested the additional weight, but responded to Ethan's urging, surging forward toward the ravine's entrance. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire erupted as their pursuers closed the distance. They plunged into the ravine's shadows, the temperature dropping further in its sheltered depths. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing them to slow, despite the danger at their backs. Rocky walls rose on either side, channeling bitter wind that cut through clothing and flesh alike. "There," Ethan pointed ahead to a fork in the ravine. "The right passage leads to higher ground. We might lose them there." The horse was tiring beneath them, its breath coming in labored clouds as it navigated the treacherous ground. 4 riders on one mount was too much to ask of any animal for long. We need to split up, Lillian said suddenly, her breath warm against Ethan's ear. They're tracking one horse. If we divide, we double our chances. No, Ethan replied immediately. Too dangerous. Listen to me, Lillian insisted. You take the children up the right fork as planned. I'll continue straight ahead, leave obvious tracks. When they follow me, double back and take the left fork. It's our best chance. Before Ethan could argue further, a bullet ricocheted off the ravine wall nearby, showering them with stone fragments. Their pursuers had entered the ravine behind them. There's no time to debate this, Lillian said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Give me your pistol. I'll lead them away, then find high ground and circle back to Miners Pass. Ethan recognized the logic in her plan, even as everything in him rebelled against it. But the children's safety had to come first. They had already witnessed too much violence, endured too much fear. With grim reluctance, he handed Lillian his revolver. 6 shots, he reminded her. Make them count. Don't engage unless you have no choice. I know, she assured him. Get the children to safety, Ethan. I'll meet you at the pass. Before he could respond, she slid from the horse's back, wincing as her injured ankle took her weight. For one suspended moment, their eyes met in the dimness, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. Be careful, Ethan said finally, the inadequate phrase standing in for everything he couldn't express in that moment. Lillian nodded, then reached up to touch each of her children's faces in brief farewell. Be brave, my loves. I'll see you soon. With that, she turned and limped purposefully down the straight passage of the ravine, making no attempt to hide her tracks in the snow. Ethan watched her go, an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Mama, Thomas cried, struggling in Ethan's grip. She's leading them away, so we can escape. Ethan explained, keeping his voice calm for the children's benefit, even as anxiety churned in his gut. Your mother is very brave and very smart. We'll see her again soon. He guided the tired horse up the right fork as planned, the passage growing steeper and narrower as they climbed. Behind them, he heard shouts as their pursuers reached the fork in the ravine. Tracks go straight. The woman's alone. Reed must be with the kids. Crawford wants all of them. Split up. Jenkins, follow the woman. We'll take the right fork. Ethan cursed under his breath. The plan had only partially worked. Lillian had drawn off one pursuer, but 2 were still on their trail. And now she was alone with an injured ankle facing a potentially armed opponent. The ravine continued its winding ascent, eventually opening onto a wind-swept ridge. Ethan urged the exhausted horse forward, searching desperately for cover. The landscape offered little scattered pines, occasional rock formations, but mainly open terrain exposed to the moonlight. A bullet kicked up snow beside them, followed by another that whispered past Ethan's ear. Their pursuers had emerged from the ravine and were firing from horseback, closing the distance rapidly. The children clung to him in terror as he spurred their mount to greater speed, but the horse was at the limits of its endurance after carrying 4 riders through difficult terrain. It stumbled, recovered, then stumbled again more severely. Ethan made a split-second decision. Hold tight, he instructed Sarah and Thomas. Then he guided the faltering horse toward a dense stand of pines at the ridge's edge. As they reached the trees, he swung down from the saddle, lifting the children after him. Run into the trees, he ordered. Hide, and don't come out no matter what you hear. I'll lead them away. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, taking her brother's hand. Like Mama did, she whispered. Exactly like Mama, Ethan confirmed. Now go quickly. The children disappeared into the shadows beneath the pines. Ethan slapped the horse's flank, sending it galloping across the open ridge, a decoy to draw attention away from the children's hiding place. He positioned himself behind a fallen log at the edge of the trees, rifle ready. The two riders appeared moments later, following the horse's tracks. In the clear moonlight, Ethan recognized one of them, Deputy Marshal Taylor, one of Crawford's loyal men from Willow Creek. "Porter," Taylor called, reining in his horse when he spotted Ethan's position. "It's over. Crawford knows everything about Reed about your investigation. Give up the kids, and maybe you walk away from this." "Like Rebecca walked away," Ethan replied, coldly adjusting his aim. "I don't think so, Taylor." The deputy's companion, a hard-faced stranger with a rifle, shifted in his saddle. "Just shoot him and be done with it. We can find the brats ourselves." "Crawford wants them alive," Taylor reminded him. "The woman, too, if Jenkins manages to catch her." The casual discussion of capturing Lillian and her children, presumably to silence them permanently, later hardened Ethan's resolve. These men were not lawmen enforcing justice. They were accomplices to trafficking and murder. "Last chance, Porter," Taylor called. "Where are the kids?" Ethan's answer was a carefully aimed shot that struck the deputy's horse. The animal reared in pain, throwing Taylor from the saddle. The second man immediately returned fire, forcing Ethan to duck behind his cover. A vicious firefight erupted, bullets splintering wood and thudding into snow around Ethan's position. He fired methodically, conserving ammunition, using the fallen log as a shield against the barrage. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot pain slicing through cold, numbed flesh. Ethan ignored it, focusing on his targets with the single-minded concentration that had once made him an exceptional lawman. Taylor had regained his feet and was circling to the left, trying to flank Ethan's position. The second man provided covering fire, pinning Ethan down with a steady stream of bullets. They were well-trained, coordinating their movements with practiced efficiency. Ethan realized he was outmatched in this direct confrontation, 2 against 1, with his position already compromised. He needed to change the terms of engagement. Waiting for a pause in the gunfire, he rolled away from the log, darting deeper into the pine stand. Bullets followed him, chewing bark from trees and kicking up snow at his heels. "He's heading for the kids," Taylor shouted. "Cut him off!" Ethan smiled grimly. They had taken the bait, assuming he was moving toward the children rather than away from them. He continued through the trees, drawing his pursuers further from Sarah and Thomas's hiding place. The forest grew denser, shadows deeper. Ethan used every trick he had learned as a lawman and soldier, moving quickly, disturbing the snow as little as possible, using trees for cover. His shoulder throbbed with each movement, warm blood freezing against his skin in the bitter cold. A shot rang out nearby, too close. Ethan froze, listening intently. Footsteps crunched in snow to his right. Taylor was closing in, moving with the confidence of a man who believed his prey was cornered. Ethan waited, controlling his breathing, despite the pain and cold. The deputy appeared between the trees, rifle raised, scanning the darkness for movement. "I know you're here, Porter," Taylor called. "It's just a matter of time now." Ethan remained motionless, waiting for the perfect moment. When Taylor turned slightly away, he struck, lunging from his hiding place and tackling the deputy before he could bring his weapon to bear. They crashed to the ground, snow erupting around them as they grappled for control of the rifle. Taylor was younger, stronger, but Ethan fought with the desperate intensity of a man protecting not just his own life, but the lives of innocent children. The rifle discharged the bullet harmlessly into the air. Ethan wrenched the weapon away, using it as a club to strike Taylor across the temple. The deputy went limp beneath him. But the respite was brief. The second man crashed through the trees, alerted by the struggle and gunshot. He fired blindly into the shadows, one bullet finding its mark in Ethan's thigh. Pain exploded through Ethan's leg, momentarily paralyzing him. He rolled away from Taylor's unconscious form, seeking cover behind a massive pine trunk. Blood pulsed from the wound with each heartbeat, staining the snow beneath him crimson. "Got you now, Porter," the man called, moving cautiously closer. "Nowhere left to run." Ethan's vision swam darkness, encroaching at its edges. He was losing blood too quickly, the combination of shoulder and thigh wounds draining his strength. His rifle lay in the snow beside Taylor, out of reach. Taylor's weapon was similarly inaccessible. The stranger advanced rifle aimed at Ethan's chest. "Crawford sends his regards," he sneered, finger tightening on the trigger. A shot cracked through the forest, but not from the man's rifle. He staggered, confusion replacing the triumphant sneer as he looked down at the spreading stain on his chest. Then he crumpled to the snow without another sound. From the trees emerged Doc Sullivan, rifle still raised as he approached the fallen man cautiously. Confirming the threat was eliminated, he hurried to Ethan's side. "Damn fool," the physician muttered, already examining Ethan's wounds. "Taking on Crawford's men alone." "Doc," Ethan managed through gritted teeth. "How did you find us?" "Followed the gunfire," Sullivan replied, applying pressure to the thigh wound. "Was on my way to Miners Pass when I heard the commotion." He glanced around. "Where are Lillian and the children?" "Split up," Ethan gasped as Doc probed the bullet wound. "Children hidden in the pines." Lillian led one of them away down the ravine. Doc's expression darkened. "Jenkins, most likely. Mean bastard, that one." He worked quickly to bandage Ethan's leg, stemming the worst of the bleeding. "Can you walk with help?" "Have to," Ethan replied, gripping the physician's offered arm. He stood shakily, pain shooting through his injured leg. "We need to find the children then, Lillian." They found Sarah and Thomas exactly where Ethan had left them, huddled together beneath a dense spruce. The children emerged cautiously at Ethan's familiar voice, their small faces lighting with relief when they saw him. "You're hurt," Sarah observed with solemn concern, pointing to the blood-stained bandages. "Just scratches?" Ethan assured her, though in truth he felt lightheaded from blood loss and pain. "Doc Sullivan is here to help us find your mother." At the mention of Lillian, Thomas's face crumpled. "Is Mama hurt too?" "We don't know yet, son," Doc answered honestly. "But we're going to find her." They made their way slowly back to Doc's sleigh, Ethan leaning heavily on Sullivan while the children followed close behind. Taylor remained unconscious, bound with his own belt, and loaded unceremoniously into the sleigh. He would stand trial for his crimes, the first thread that, when pulled, might unravel Crawford's entire operation. "The ravine," Ethan directed once they were all aboard. Lillian went straight ahead at the fork, leading one of Crawford's men away from us. Doc turned the sleigh toward the ravine entrance, urging the horses to greater speed despite the difficult terrain. Ethan sat with the children pressed against his sides, his rifle ready despite his injuries. Every moment that passed increased his anxiety for Lillian's safety. "Mr. Porter," Sarah whispered as they traveled, "what if the bad man caught Mama?" Ethan forced confidence into his voice that he didn't entirely feel. "Your mother is very smart and very brave. She knows how to hide, how to survive." The child seemed to accept this, but Ethan could not quiet his own fears so easily. Lillian was injured alone, facing a man who would show no mercy. The odds were long and growing longer with each passing minute. They reached the ravine as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Doc guided the sleigh carefully down the narrow passage, following the tracks Lillian and her pursuer had left hours before. The ravine wound deeper into the landscape, shadows still thick in its depths despite the approaching daylight. They proceeded cautiously alert for any sound or movement ahead. The tracks continued for nearly a mile, before veering suddenly up a steep side passage. Lillian had apparently changed course, perhaps seeking higher ground or a defensive position. "She's leading him in circles," Doc observed with grudging admiration, "making him work for it." The side passage was too narrow for the sleigh. Ethan handed the reins of Taylor's horse, which they had brought along, to Sarah. "Wait here with Thomas and our prisoner," he instructed. "Doc and I will follow on foot." Despite Doc's protests about his injuries, Ethan insisted on continuing the search himself. They followed the tracks up the increasingly steep incline, Ethan leaning on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a broken pine branch. At the top of the passage, they emerged onto a small plateau overlooking the main ravine. The tracks led toward a jumble of massive boulders, a perfect defensive position offering both cover and visibility. "Lillian," Ethan called, approaching cautiously. "It's Ethan and Doc Sullivan." Silence greeted them, ominous, heavy silence broken only by the whisper of wind across stone. "Spread out," Ethan directed grimly. "Look for any sign." They searched methodically, following footprints in the snow that told a story of pursuit and evasion. The tracks circled the boulder formation twice before leading to its center, a natural stone chamber formed by fallen rocks. "Blood," Doc said quietly, pointing to dark stains in the snow. "Not much, but recent." Ethan's heart constricted with fear as he moved deeper into the stone labyrinth. More blood marked the path, along with signs of a struggle-disturbed snow, a broken branch that might have served as a weapon. They rounded a final boulder to find a body sprawled face down in crimson-stained snow. Jenkins Crawford's man lay motionless with Ethan's revolver still clutched in his lifeless hand. A rough stone with blood and hair adhering to it lay nearby, not a gunshot then, but a desperate primal defense. But of Lillian, there was no sign. "She survived," Doc said, examining the scene with a physician's eye. "Looks like he got off a shot." He pointed to a bullet hole in a nearby tree before she struck him with that rock. Then she took his gun and continued on. Relief flooded through Ethan, making his knees weak beneath him. "Which way?" Doc pointed to a faint trail leading north from the boulder formation. "That direction toward Miners Pass. She's still following the plan." They made their way back to the sleigh, and children sharing the news that their mother was alive and heading for their rendezvous point. Sarah and Thomas brightened visibly, the tension easing from their small shoulders. "Mama's very strong," Sarah declared with absolute certainty. "Papa always said she was too stubborn to break." "Your father was right about that at least," Doc agreed, helping Ethan into the sleigh. They continued toward Miners Pass, following Lillian's increasingly erratic trail. The signs worried Ethan. She was clearly tiring, possibly injured, her path meandering rather than direct. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached the pass, a narrow gap between towering cliffs that marked the border between counties. From here, Helena was less than a day's journey, and with it, the federal marshals who might finally bring Crawford to justice. "There!" Thomas suddenly cried, pointing ahead to a small figure trudging through knee-deep snow. Lillian turned at the sound of the approaching sleigh, raising Jenkins's revolver in a hand that visibly trembled with exhaustion. When she recognized them, the weapon fell from her grasp as she sagged to her knees in the snow. Ethan was out of the sleigh before it fully stopped, ignoring the searing pain in his leg as he half ran, half limped to her side. He reached her just as her strength finally gave out, catching her before she could collapse completely. "You found me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold and exertion. "The children." "Safe," Ethan assured her, gathering her close. "Everyone's safe." She smiled faintly, then her eyes widened as she noticed his bandaged shoulder and thigh. You're hurt. So are you, he replied, noting the dried blood at her temple and the way she favored her right side. But we're alive, all of us. Doc and the children reached them, then Sarah and Thomas throwing themselves against their mother with cries of relief and joy. Lillian embraced them fiercely, despite her injuries, tears streaming down her face. I thought I'd lost you, she murmured into their hair. I was so afraid. We knew you'd come back, Sarah said simply. Mr. Porter promised. Lillian's gaze met Ethan's over the children's heads, gratitude and something deeper shining in her eyes despite her exhaustion. Thank you, she mouthed silently. Doc Sullivan cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Touching as this reunion is, we're still exposed and a long way from safety. Crawford won't stop hunting you just because you've crossed county lines. He was right, of course. They loaded Lillian carefully into the sleigh alongside their still unconscious prisoner. Ethan's injuries and Lillian's exhaustion made for slow progress, but by mid-afternoon they had left the mountains behind. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills giving way to the distant rooftops and smoke plumes of Helena. Almost there, Doc encouraged as both Ethan and Lillian struggled to remain conscious despite blood loss and fatigue. Just hold on a little longer. The federal marshal's office was an imposing stone building in the center of Helena. They arrived as twilight descended their strange procession, drawing curious stares from passers-by, a battered sleigh carrying 2 injured adults, 2 solemn children, and an unconscious bound man. Marshal James Hargrove was an old friend of Ethan's, a career lawman with an uncompromising sense of justice. His weathered face registered shock when Ethan limped into his office, followed by Doc supporting Lillian and the children. Porter, Hargrove stood taking in their bedraggled state with a lawman's assessing gaze. What in God's name? Judge Crawford, Ethan interrupted, placing his leather portfolio of evidence on the marshal's desk. Trafficking operation, murder, corruption. It's all there. 3 years of investigation. Hargrove's expression hardened as he flipped through the documents. This is explosive, Ethan. Goes beyond Crawford to some very powerful people. I know. Ethan glanced at Lillian and her children. And these 3 are key witnesses. Crawford's men have already tried to kill us twice to prevent this evidence from reaching you. The marshal studied Lillian with newfound respect. Ma'am, you and your children will have federal protection until this is resolved. You have my word. Thank you, Marshal, Lillian replied with quiet dignity, despite her exhaustion. But what happens now? To Judge Crawford and his associates? Justice happens, Hargrove stated firmly, starting with arrests tonight. Crawford, his deputies, anyone involved in this operation. He looked to Ethan. I'll need formal statements from all of you, but that can wait until you've seen a doctor and gotten some rest. Doc Sullivan stepped forward. I've treated their immediate injuries, but they both need proper medical attention. The children, too, exposure, malnutrition, and trauma, all need addressing. Hargrove nodded, already issuing orders to his deputies. Within the hour, they were settled in the town's best hotel under guard, a physician summoned to tend their wounds properly. Later that night, with the children finally asleep in the adjoining room, Ethan and Lillian found themselves alone for the first time since their harrowing ordeal began. They sat beside the fire in the hotel suite's sitting room, bandaged and medicated, the worst of their physical pain dulled by laudanum and relief. It doesn't seem real, Lillian said softly, watching the flames dance in the hearth. That it's finally over. That we're safe. Crawford will fight the charges, Ethan cautioned. His influence reaches far, but with our evidence, Hargrove believes the case is solid. Lillian nodded absently, touching the fresh bandage at her temple where Jenkins had struck her during their struggle. And Victor, what happens to his body? A pauper's grave, unless you specify otherwise. Ethan answered gently. The children need never know the details. No, she agreed. They've seen too much already. She paused, then added hesitantly, What will you do now, Ethan, return to your cabin? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. A future hanging in the balance, possibilities unspoken, but present in the air between them. Ethan considered carefully before answering. I don't think I can go back to that solitude, not after. He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had transpired between them. After what? Lillian pressed her eyes, searching his face. After remembering what it means to protect something beyond a memory, Ethan said finally. After finding purpose again. After. He hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. After meeting you and your children. Lillian's breath caught hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. What are you saying, Ethan? He moved from his chair to kneel before her, despite his injured leg, taking her hands in his. I'm saying that these past days have changed me, Lillian. Woken something I thought died with Rebecca. I'm saying that I care for you and your children more than I believed possible. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. It's too soon, she whispered. We barely know each other. And after Victor, I never thought I could trust. I know, Ethan interrupted gently. I'm not proposing marriage tonight, Lillian. Only possibility. Time to heal, to learn each other properly. To see if what I feel, what I hope you might feel too, can grow into something lasting. A tear spilled down Lillian's cheek as she squeezed his hands. The children adore you already, she said softly. And I've never met a man like you, Ethan. One who sees strength instead of weakness, who offers protection without demanding submission. Is that a yes to possibility? Ethan asked, a rare smile lighting his features. Lillian nodded, her own smile breaking through tears like sunshine after storm. Yes, to possibility, to time, to healing together. Ethan raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a promise of patience, of care of a future neither had dared imagine just days before. Outside snow began to fall again, soft and gentle against the hotel windows. But inside warmth bloomed not just from the fire, but from the tentative new beginning, taking root between two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances. In the adjoining room, Sarah and Thomas slept peacefully for the first time in months, free from the shadows that had haunted their young lives. And in the sitting room, Ethan and Lillian spoke quietly into the night, sharing stories, fears, hopes, laying the foundation for whatever might come next. The path ahead would not be easy. Crawford's trial would demand courage from all of them. The children's trauma would require patience and understanding to heal. Ethan and Lillian's own wounds, both physical and emotional, would take time to mend completely. But, as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Helena in pristine white, Ethan felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Not just for justice now, but for joy, for family, for love. The snow on good earth promised renewal, growth, possibility, just as the woman beside him promised a future he had believed forever lost. And for tonight, that promise was enough.